Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the frozen heart of the American wilderness. A place where the cold is not just a season, but a living, breathing predator. We're talking about the mountain men, those half-wild trappers, wanderers, and survivors who learned to outwit winter itself. Forget the Hollywood image of rugged heroes with perfect beards and endless supplies. The truth is, the mountain men's mastery of the cold was paid for in blood, frostbite, and 1,000 tiny acts of stubborn genius. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy calm, long-form stories like this one. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always heartwarming to see how these quiet stories of history bring people together from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in the Rocky Mountains in the year 1832. The fire is dying, your hands are shaking so badly you can barely feed it another stick. Outside your shelter, it's so cold your spit freezes before it hits the ground. Modern survival experts estimate that in such conditions, you might have only about 3 hours to live. Yet somehow a man named Hugh Glass survived not just one night like this, but months of it with no Gore-Tex, no emergency beacon, just animal skins, basic tools, and knowledge so valuable it might as well have been magic. The mountain men didn't have weather apps or heated jackets. They had something better, a deep, almost spiritual understanding of the cold. They knew that winter wasn't just a season. It was a predator, and it attacked in 4 specific ways: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. They didn't know the scientific terms, but they knew the reality. They learned to read the cold like a hunter reads tracks in the snow. The first lesson was always about the ground. The earth is a heat thief that never sleeps, ready to steal warmth from your body at every point of contact. The old trappers would say, never, ever sleep directly on the ground in winter. So you'd build a thick bed of pine boughs roughly a foot high between 2 parallel logs. Not for comfort, though it was better than nothing, but because without this barrier, you'd be dead by morning. The ground would pull the heat right out of you faster than you could make it. Above you, the cold sky was another enemy. Even on a still night, an uncovered head or exposed hands would radiate heat away from the body. The mountain man's wool or fur cap was not a fashion statement. It was a critical piece of heat retention gear. He knew that an uncovered head was a chimney for body heat. Modern studies show that uncovered skin, including the head, can lose significant warmth rapidly in extreme cold, making head protection essential. He wore his hat to bed, pulling his buffalo robe over his head as he slept, plugging every potential leak with obsessive care. But the wind was the most insidious killer. Every gust that penetrated your clothing stripped away the thin, warm layer of air your body worked so hard to create. Wind chill was not a concept he knew by name, but he understood its brutal reality. At around 40 below, with a steady 20 miles per hour wind, perceived cold can plunge to levels that freeze exposed skin within minutes. To combat this, he relied on a windproof outer layer, often a buckskin shirt or a heavy wool capote. Unlike modern breathable fabrics that can fail in high winds, the dense grain of brain-tanned leather was a near impenetrable barrier. And then there was sweat. The mountain man knew that sweat was a death sentence in winter. That moisture was the cold's greatest ally. Water evaporating from the skin carries away heat 25 times faster than air. This is why he dressed in layers. Not just for insulation, but for moisture control. He could add or remove layers to prevent overheating during strenuous work like tracking game or chopping wood. His inner layers were wool, a fiber that kept warmth even when damp. It was nature's insulation, reliable long before science could explain why. He knew the trapper saying cotton kills. A sweaty cotton shirt was a cold, clammy shroud that would suck the life out of him. The mountain man's clothing was not a static uniform. It was a living, breathing shield, constantly adjusted to match his activity level and the changing conditions. This was the key difference between his approach and ours. We put on a jacket and expect it to work in all conditions. He knew better. The foundation was wool. Wool was the miracle fiber of the frontier. It could absorb up to 30% of its weight and moisture without feeling wet and retained its insulating properties even when damp. This was the critical factor. A mountain man knew he would get wet either from external snow or his own sweat. A wool shirt or union suit acted as a buffer, wicking moisture away from the skin while still keeping him warm. It was his second skin. The wool used by mountain men was often greasy wool that had not been fully scoured of its natural lanolin. This lanolin made the wool naturally water-resistant and gave it a distinctive, slightly oily smell. It also made it incredibly durable. A good wool shirt could last for years of hard use. Over the wool came buckskin. A Brainerd tanned buckskin shirt was his windproof, breathable soft shell jacket. It was incredibly tough and blocked convective heat loss. A properly tanned buckskin shirt could stop the wind while still allowing some moisture vapor to escape. This prevented the buildup of sweat that would later freeze. However, buckskin's fatal flaw was that it lost its insulating properties when wet. Becoming heavy and stiff, the mountain man treated his buckskins with beaver fat or bear grease for water resistance, rubbing the fat into the leather until it was saturated. This created a semi-waterproof barrier that would shed light rain and snow. But he knew that in a prolonged downpour, he needed his final layer. The capote, or blanket coat, was his hard shell, made from a heavy wool blanket, often a Hudson's Bay Point blanket. The capote was a masterpiece of functional design. It was a long hooded coat worn over all other layers. The dense oily wool was highly water-resistant, shedding snow and rain. The hood protected the head and face, and the long cut protected the legs. The capote was a portable shelter, a final defense against the elements. This system was not static. The mountain man constantly adjusted it, shedding a layer during strenuous work, and immediately putting it back on when he stopped. He understood that staying warm was about balance. The balance between heat production and heat loss, insulation and ventilation. It was a delicate life or death dance. He knew that if he overheated and sweated, he would pay for it later when he stopped moving and the sweat froze against his skin. For the mountain man, fire was not just a convenience. It was the difference between life and death. In the deep winter, when the wind howled through the pines and the snow piled up against the door of your lianto, fire was your only friend. It was warmth, light, safety, and hope, all rolled into one. But making fire in the mountains was never easy. The mountain man's fire kit was a study in redundancy and reliability. The core of the kit was always the same: flint, steel, and char cloth. The flint was a hard, sharp-edged stone, usually chipped from river rock or traded from Native Americans. The steel was a C-shaped striker, forged from high-carbon metal, hardened and tempered to throw a shower of sparks with every strike. Char cloth was the secret weapon, made by heating linen or cotton in an airtight tin. The resulting blackened fabric would catch a spark and smolder with a low, steady heat. It was the perfect bridge between the fleeting spark and the sustained flame. The mountain man would keep his char cloth dry at all costs, storing it in a waterproof pouch or a hollowed-out horn. When it was time to make fire, the ritual was always the same. Strike the flint against the steel, showering sparks onto the char cloth. When a spark caught, you'd see a tiny red glow, barely visible in the daylight. You'd fold the char cloth into a tinder bundle, a nest of shredded cedar bark, dry grass, or cattail fluff, and blow gently, coaxing the ember to life. With a sudden whoosh, the tinder would burst into flame, and you'd feed it with small twigs, then larger sticks, until you had a fire big enough to warm your hands and cook your food. But the mountain man was never satisfied with just one way to make fire. He always had a backup plan. A burning glass. A simple magnifying lens could focus the sun's rays onto dry tinder, igniting it in seconds on a clear day. A bow drill made from a bent stick. a spindle, and a fireboard could create friction heat to start a fire even when the flint and steel failed. Matches, when available, were hoarded like gold, used only in the diest emergencies. The mountain man knew that the man with only one way to make fire was a dead man waiting to happen. He practiced his firemaking skills until they were second nature, able to start a blaze in rain, snow, or howling wind. He knew that a single ember could mean the difference between survival and a frozen death. To the mountain man, the forest was not just a backdrop. It was a living, breathing resource filled with materials for shelter, fuel, and tools. He knew the language of wood as intimately as he knew the lines on his own hands. He could look at a tree and know its name, its properties, and its uses. He knew that softwoods like pine and fir burned hot and fast, perfect for getting a fire going quickly. He knew that hardwoods like oak and hickory burned slow and steady, producing a long, lasting bed of coals, perfect for cooking and overnight warmth. He knew that standing deadwood was the best source of dry fuel. Even in a rainstorm, a dead tree that is still standing has had time to dry out. And its bark often sheds water, keeping the inner wood dry. He could read the forest like a library of fuel, selecting the right wood for the right job. He knew the specific properties of dozens of tree species. Cedar bark made excellent tinder. Birch bark would burn even when wet. Cottonwood produced a lot of smoke but little heat. Aspen burned clean and hot. Willow and alder were good for quick hot fires for cooking, while oak and hickory were best for long-lasting coals. His fires were not just piles of burning logs. They were carefully engineered structures. The reflector fire with a wall of logs or rocks built behind it would reflect heat into his lean-to shelter, effectively doubling the warmth. The starfire, with logs arranged like the spokes of a wheel, would burn slowly through the night, requiring minimal tending. As each log burned, he would push it further into the center. The Dakota firehole, a fire built in a pit with an air tunnel, would conceal the flames and burn efficiently even in high winds, drawing air from below and creating a natural draft. Fire was the center of his world. It cooked his food, dried his clothes, and kept the predators of the night at bay. But more than that, it was a source of psychological comfort, a bulwark against the crushing loneliness of the winter wilderness. A man alone in the mountains with only the howl of the wind and the cry of the wolf for company could find solace in the crackling flames. Fire was a companion, a friend, a lifeline to sanity. The mountain man's most important weapon against the cold was his own body. He understood that the human body is a furnace that must be stoked with the right fuel. Fat was the high-octane energy source of the fur trade. His diet was a carnivore's dream, consuming massive quantities of meat with a focus on the fattiest parts. Tongue, liver, bone marrow, and the thick back fat of a buffalo. He considered beaver tail, a solid mass of fat, a delicacy. A single beaver tail could weigh 2 or 3 pounds and was almost pure fat. Roasted over a fire until the skin blistered and peeled away, the meat inside was rich, oily, and incredibly calorie-dense. It was a prized food, often reserved for special occasions or shared among friends. He knew about rabbit starvation, the paradoxical condition where a man could starve on a diet of lean meat. Rabbit meat is so lean that the body expends more energy digesting it than it gains from the protein. Without fat, the body cannot properly metabolize protein. The result is a slow, agonizing death. Even with a full belly, the mountain men called it mal de caribou or rabbit sickness. They knew that protein alone was not enough. They needed fat. He consumed an estimated between 5.000 and 6.00 calories a day. Much of it from fat to fuel his internal furnace and maintain his core body temperature. In the extreme cold of a Rocky Mountain winter, the body burns calories at an accelerated rate just to stay warm. This high-fat diet also powered the strenuous physical labor of his daily life. Setting traps, skinning animals, chopping wood, and traveling through deep snow. He was a master of preserving his fuel. He rendered buffalo fat into tallow, a hard white fat that could be stored for months without spoiling. He smoked meat into jerky, concentrating the protein and making it lightweight and portable. He made pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and berries, a superfood that could sustain a man for days. A pound of pemmican contained over 3.00 calories and would not spoil for years. This reliance on fat shaped his hunting strategies. He didn't just hunt for meat. He hunted for fat. He knew a bear just before hibernation was a walking treasure trove of calories. Its body packed with thick layers of fat. He knew that a buffalo cow in the fall after a summer of grazing on rich prairie grasses would have a thick layer of back fat. Sometimes 6 in deep. This was the prize, the fuel that would keep him alive through the winter. The mountain man's shelter was not a permanent structure. It was a temporary, adaptable refuge designed to keep him alive in the harshest conditions. He knew that the best shelter was the one that could be built quickly with materials at hand, and that provided maximum protection from wind, snow, and cold. The classic mountain man shelter was the lianto, a simple structure made by propping a series of poles against a fallen log or a standing tree, then covering them with branches, bark, or animal hides. The open side faced away from the prevailing wind, and a fire was built just outside the entrance. The heat from the fire would be reflected into the shelter by a wall of logs or rocks, creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen wilderness. In deep snow, the mountain man might build a snow cave or a quinsy, a mound of snow hollowed out to create an insulated chamber. Snow is an excellent insulator, and a well-built snow shelter can maintain a temperature just below freezing, even when the outside air is 40 below. The key was to create enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from the fire or the man's own breath. When traveling light, the mountain man might rely on nothing more than a buffalo robe and a bed of pine boughs. He would choose his campsite carefully, looking for natural windbreaks, dry ground, and access to firewood and water. He knew that the difference between life and death could be as simple as the right choice of campsite. The mountain man's shelter was not just a physical structure, it was a psychological refuge, a place where he could rest, recover, and prepare for the next day's challenges. The act of building a shelter was a ritual, a way of asserting control over an environment that was otherwise indifferent or hostile. It was a statement of intent. I will survive. I will endure. I will master the cold. The mountain man's tools were not just objects. They were extensions of his will to survive. Every item in his kit had to earn its place, serving multiple purposes and withstanding the harshest conditions. There was no room for luxury, only for what could keep a man alive when the mercury dropped and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. The knife was the mountain man's constant companion. It was used for everything: skinning beaver, cutting saplings for shelter, slicing meat, scraping hides, and even as a last line of defense against man or beast. A good knife was a treasure, often traded for a month's worth of pelts or more. The blade was kept sharp with a wet stone, and the handle was often wrapped in rawhide for extra grip, even when numb fingers struggled to hold on. The axe, or hatchet, was next in importance. It was smaller and lighter than the axes used by lumberjacks, but no less essential. With it, the mountain man could fell small trees, split firewood, build shelters, and break through river ice to reach water. The axe was also a weapon, and more than one trapper owed his life to a well-timed swing in a desperate moment. The fire-starting kit was always close at hand, protected from moisture and damage. Flint, steel, and char cloth were the core components. But the mountain man might also carry a burning glass, a bow drill, or a small supply of matches if he could obtain them. Matches were rare and precious, often reserved for emergencies when all else failed. Traps were both tools and lifelines. The mountain man relied on traps to catch fur-bearing animals, supplement his diet, and provide materials for clothing and shelter. He carried a variety of traps, from simple deadfalls to more complex steel traps, and he knew how to set them in the most effective locations. A well-placed trap could mean the difference between a full belly and a night of gnawing hunger. The rifle was both a hunting tool and a means of defense. The mountain man's rifle was a long, heavy weapon designed for accuracy and power rather than rapid fire. He carried a supply of powder and ball carefully protected from moisture. And he knew how to reload and fire under the most challenging conditions. The rifle was cleaned and oiled religiously because a misfire in the cold could be fatal. The sewing kit was a small but essential part of the mountain man's gear. He carried needles, thread, and patches for repairing clothing, moccasins, and gear. In the wilderness, a torn garment or a broken strap could be a life-threatening problem. And the ability to make repairs on the fly was a mark of a true survivor. Sinew from animals was often used as thread, and scraps of hide became patches for worn-out moccasins. A small kettle or pot was another prized possession. With it, the mountain man could boil water to make it safe for drinking, cook stews from whatever meat and roots he could find, and render fat for pemmican or tallow candles. The pot was often blackened from years of use, its handle wrapped in cloth to protect against burns. A powder horn carved from buffalo or cow horn kept gunpowder dry and ready for use. The horn was often decorated with carvings or scrimshaw telling the story of its owner's travels and adventures. A shot pouch held lead balls, patches, and other shooting supplies slung across the chest for easy access. A compass, if he was lucky enough to own one, was a lifeline in the trackless wilderness. But most mountain men relied on the sun, stars, and their own sense of direction, honed by years of travel and observation. They could read the lay of the land, the flow of rivers, and the shape of distant mountains to find their way. A tobacco pouch and pipe were small comforts in a hard life. Tobacco was traded with Native Americans and other trappers, and a pipeful at the end of a long day was a rare pleasure. The smoke was said to keep mosquitoes at bay, and the ritual of lighting a pipe was a way to mark the end of another day survived. The mountain man's greatest weapon against the cold was not his clothing, his fire, or his tools. It was his mindset, a combination of humility, adaptability, and relentless observation. He knew that the cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be respected and understood. He paid attention to the smallest details, the direction of the wind, the color of the sky, the behavior of animals, the feel of the air on his skin. He knew that a sudden drop in temperature could signal an approaching storm, that the sound of cracking ice could warn of danger, that the movement of birds could indicate the presence of predators or prey. He was constantly learning, adapting, and improvising. He knew that no two winters were the same, that no 2 days in the mountains were identical. He was willing to change his plans, adjust his strategies, and try new approaches when the old ones failed. He was not afraid to make mistakes, but he was quick to learn from them. He was humble in the face of nature's power. He knew that the mountains could kill him at any moment, that the cold was indifferent to his suffering, that survival was never guaranteed. He did not take unnecessary risks, did not boast of his abilities, did not underestimate the challenges he faced. He respected the cold, and in return, he learned to master it. He was resilient in the face of hardship. He endured pain, discomfort, and loneliness without complaint. He found meaning in the struggle, satisfaction in the small victories, and joy in the beauty of the wilderness. He was not a hero or a legend. He was a survivor, and that was enough. The mountain man's mindset was forged in hardship and tested by every winter. He learned to accept discomfort as a fact of life, to find pleasure in small comforts, and to keep moving forward no matter how bleak the outlook. He knew that the only way out was through and that the cold would not wait for him to catch his breath. He was a master of patience. He could wait for hours in a snowdrift, watching a beaver pond for the slightest ripple. He could endure days of hunger, knowing that a single successful hunt could mean survival for another week. He could sit by a dying fire, conserving his last handful of tinder, waiting for the wind to shift or the snow to stop. He was a master of improvisation, When his moccasins wore out, he made new ones from the hide of a deer he had trapped. When his firewood ran low, he burned dried buffalo chips or twisted grass. When his rifle jammed, he took it apart, cleaned it with a strip of cloth, and put it back together by firelight. He was a master of observation. He could read the tracks of a snowshoe hare in the fresh powder, tell the age of a moose trail by the depth of the prints, and predict the weather by the shape of the clouds. He knew that the difference between life and death could be as simple as noticing a change in the wind or the sound of distant thunder. He was a master of acceptance. He knew that not every day would be a victory, that not every plan would succeed, that not every friend would survive the winter. He learned to accept loss, to mourn quickly, and to move on. He knew that the mountains did not care about his feelings, and that survival depended on his ability to adapt and endure. The mountain man was often alone, but he was never truly isolated. He was part of a brotherhood, a loose network of trappers, traders, and wanderers who shared knowledge, resources, and support. This brotherhood was not based on blood or nationality, but on shared experience and mutual respect. When mountain men met in the wilderness, they would exchange news, trade supplies, and share stories around the fire. They would teach each other new skills, warn of dangers, and offer help in times of need. The code of the mountains was simple: help when you can, ask for help when you need it, and never leave a man to die alone. The rendezvous was the highlight of the mountain man's year, a gathering of trappers, traders, and Native Americans where furs were exchanged for supplies. News was shared, and friendships were renewed. The rendezvous was a time of celebration, but also a time of learning. As mountain men compared notes on survival strategies, new technologies, and the ever-changing challenges of the wilderness, the Brotherhood of the Cold was not always harmonious. There were rivalries, conflicts, and betrayals, but in the end, the shared struggle against the cold created a bond that transcended differences and endured through hardship. The mountain man's respect for Native American knowledge was profound. He learned from the people who had survived in the mountains for generations. How to build a snow shelter, how to find edible plants in winter, how to read the signs of approaching weather. He traded for moccasins, snowshoes, and pekin, and he listened to the stories and wisdom of those who knew the land best. The brotherhood extended beyond the living. The mountain man honored the memory of those who had gone before him, marking their graves with simple corners or wooden crosses. He told their stories around the fire, passing on their lessons and their warnings to the next generation. He knew that every man who survived the winter owed a debt to those who had paved the way. The mountain man's relationship with food was shaped by necessity, not preference. In the depths of winter, calories were not just fuel, they were survival. Every meal was a calculation. How much energy would it take to find, prepare, and eat this food, and would it be enough to keep the internal furnace burning through another night? Meat was the mainstay, but not all meat was created equal. The mountain man prized fat above all else. He knew from bitter experience that a diet of nothing but lean meat, rabbit, for example, would lead to a slow, wasting death. The body needed fat to metabolize protein, to keep the mind sharp, and to stoke the fires of metabolism against the relentless cold. Buffalo, when available, was the gold standard. A single buffalo could provide hundreds of pounds of meat, fat, and marrow. The hump and back fat were rendered into tallow, used for cooking, preserving, and even as a base for candles. The tongue was a delicacy, the liver a source of vital nutrients, and the bones were cracked open for their rich, oily marrow. Beaver, muskrat, and other fur-bearing animals were also on the menu. The tail of the beaver, a solid mass of fat, was roasted over the fire and eaten with reverence. Muskrat was considered a treat, especially in the early spring when the animals were at their fattest. Even the smallest animals, squirrels, chipmunks, birds, were trapped, roasted, and consumed, bones and all. Fish, when available, was a welcome change. Trout, pike, and whitefish were caught through holes in the ice or in open water when the streams ran free. The mountain man would smoke or dry the fish for later use, knowing that a sudden thaw or a broken trap line could leave him hungry for days. Roots, berries, and wild plants were rare in winter, but the mountain man knew where to find them. The inner bark of certain trees could be scraped and boiled into a starchy gel. Wild onions and garlic dug from beneath the snow added flavor and nutrients to stews. Dried berries gathered in the fall and stored in leather pouches provided a burst of sweetness, and vitamin C. Pemmican was the ultimate survival food. Made from dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, it was lightweight, portable, and nearly indestructible. A single pound of pemmican could provide over 3.00 calories, enough to sustain a man through a day of hard travel or a night of bitter cold. The recipe was learned from Native Americans, who had perfected the art of preserving food for the long, hungry months between hunts. The mountain man's diet was not about pleasure. It was about survival. He ate what he could find when he could find it and wasted nothing. Every scrap of fat, every bone, every root and berry was precious. Hunger was a constant companion, and the memory of a full belly was enough to keep a man moving through the snow, searching for the next meal. As the sun dipped behind the mountains and the temperature plummeted, the mountain man's thoughts turned to survival. Night was the true test of his mastery over the cold. The rituals of nightfall were as precise and necessary as any religious observance. The first task was always to secure the fire. The mountain man would gather an armload of dry wood, pine, fir, or whatever he could find, and stack it within easy reach of his sleeping place. He would bank the fire, piling ashes over the coals to keep them alive through the night. A well-banked fire could smolder for hours, ready to be revived with a few sticks and a breath of air. Next came the shelter. If he was lucky, he had a lianto or a snow cave. If not, he would improvise. A buffalo robe draped over a fallen log, a bed of pine boughs beneath a canopy of branches, a hollow in the snow lined with dry grass. The key was to create a barrier between his body and the cold to trap as much heat as possible and block the wind. Clothing was adjusted for sleep. Wet garments were removed and hung near the fire to dry. Dry socks, if available, were put on. The wool cap was pulled down over the ears, and the buffalo robe was wrapped tightly around the body with the edges tucked in to prevent drafts. The mountain man knew that even a small gap could let in enough cold air to rob him of precious heat. Food was eaten before sleep if possible. A hot meal, a stew of meat and roots, a chunk of pemmican, a cup of broth would stoke the internal furnace and provide energy for the long hours of darkness. The mountain man knew that going to bed hungry was a recipe for disaster. The body needed fuel to generate heat, and a full stomach was the best defense against the cold. Water was melted from snow or ice, boiled to kill parasites, and drunk in small sips. Dehydration was a hidden danger in winter, as the cold air drew moisture from the body with every breath. The mountain man made a habit of drinking before sleep, knowing that thirst could wake him in the night and force him to leave the warmth of his shelter. Before lying down, the mountain man would check his traps, secure his gear, and scan the darkness for signs of danger. Wolves, bears, and other predators were rare in winter, but not unknown. A careless man could wake to find his food stolen, his shelter destroyed, or worse. Finally, he would settle into his bed, curling into a ball to conserve heat, and let the darkness close in. Sleep was never deep or restful. The mountain man learned to doze lightly, waking at the slightest sound or the first hint of cold. He would rise to feed the fire, adjust his robe or check the wind, then slip back into a half-dreaming state, always alert, always ready. The rituals of nightfall were a matter of life and death. The mountain man performed them with the precision of a priest, knowing that a single mistake could mean a night of misery or a morning that never came. The mountain man was not a scientist in the modern sense, but his survival depended on a deep understanding of the principles that govern heat, cold, and the human body. He learned through experience, observation, and the hard lessons of trial and error. He knew that heat always flows from warm to cold, and that the body loses heat through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. He learned to minimize these losses by insulating himself from the ground, blocking the wind, covering exposed skin and managing moisture. He understood the importance of layering. Each layer of clothing trapped a thin layer of air which acted as insulation. Wool was best for the inner layers as it retained heat even when wet. Buckskin or leather was best for the outer layer as it blocked wind and shed snow. The capote or blanket coat was the final barrier, a portable shelter that could be wrapped around the body or used as a sleeping bag. He knew that the body generates heat through metabolism, and that food, especially fat, was the fuel for this internal furnace. He learned to eat before sleep, to keep his energy up during the day, and to avoid the deadly trap of rabbit starvation. He understood the dangers of dehydration. Even in the cold, he learned to melt snow for water, to drink regularly, and to avoid alcohol, which could lower the body's core temperature and impair judgment. He was a master of fire, able to start a blaze in any weather with any materials. He knew the best woods for tinder, kindling, and fuel. He could build a fire that would burn all night, or a quick blaze to warm his hands and cook a meal. He was an expert in shelter construction, able to build a lianto, a snow cave, or a debris hut with whatever materials were at hand. He knew how to site his shelter to avoid wind, how to insulate it with branches or snow, and how to ventilate it to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. He was a keen observer of the weather, able to predict storms by the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind, and the behavior of animals. He learned to read the signs of changing weather and to prepare for sudden drops in temperature. He was a student of the human body, able to recognize the signs of hypothermia, frostbite, and dehydration. He knew how to treat these conditions with the resources available: warming a frozen limb by the fire, rehydrating with melted snow, or sharing body heat with a companion. The mountain man's science was practical, immediate, and unforgiving. There was no room for theory or speculation. Every lesson was learned the hard way, and every mistake was paid for in pain, suffering, or death. The mountain man's mastery of the cold was not just about what he wore or what he ate. It was about how he moved through the world. Every step, every breath, every decision was shaped by the need to conserve energy, avoid injury, and stay one step ahead of the elements. Travel in winter was a test of endurance and ingenuity. Snowshoes, borrowed from Native American technology, were essential for moving across deep drifts. Made from bent ash frames and rawhide webbing, snowshoes distributed a man's weight over a larger area, preventing him from sinking into the snow. The mountain man learned to walk with a rolling gait, lifting each foot carefully to avoid tripping on the frames. When the snow was crusted with ice, he would use a staff or pole to test the surface ahead, probing for hidden dangers: thin ice over a stream, a buried log, or a sudden drop. He moved slowly and deliberately, knowing that a twisted ankle or a broken leg could be a death sentence miles from help. River crossings were especially dangerous in winter. The mountain man would search for the narrowest, shallowest point, using his staff to test the ice. If he had to wade, he would strip off his outer layers, keeping them dry, and move quickly through the freezing water. Once across, he would dry himself by the fire, rubbing his skin to restore circulation and donning his clothes as soon as they were warm. Climbing in the mountains required a different set of skills. The mountain man learned to read the snow, looking for signs of avalanches or unstable slopes. He would zigzag up steep inclines using his staff for balance and avoid traveling during the warmest part of the day when the snow was most likely to slide. Rest was as important as movement. The mountain man knew when to push on and when to hunker down and wait out a storm. He listened to his body, recognizing the signs of exhaustion, dehydration, and cold stress. He learned to pace himself, to take short breaks in sheltered spots, and to keep moving just enough to stay warm without sweating. The art of movement was about more than survival. It was about efficiency, grace, and respect for the land. The mountain man moved like a ghost through the wilderness, leaving as little trace as possible, conserving his strength for the battles that mattered. No story of the mountain man's mastery of the cold would be complete without honoring the wisdom of the Native Americans who had survived in the mountains for countless generations. The mountain men learned from the people who knew the land best. Adopting their technologies, their strategies, and their respect for the natural world, the Native Americans taught the mountain men how to build snow shelters, igloos, snow caves, and Quincy huts that could keep a man alive in the worst blizzard. They showed them how to make moccasins from smoked hide insulated with fur or grass that stayed flexible and warm even in deep snow. They shared the secrets of snowshoes, toboggans, and sleds for winter travel. They taught the mountain men how to find edible plants in winter, cattail roots, wild onions, and the inner bark of certain trees. They showed them how to make pemmican, the ultimate survival food, and how to store it for months without spoilage. The Native Americans also taught the mountain men the importance of community. In the harshest winters, survival was often a group effort. Families and bands would share food, shelter, and labor, pooling their resources to get through the lean months. The mountain men, often solitary by nature, learned to value these alliances and to repay kindness with kindness. The wisdom of the natives extended to the spiritual realm as well. They taught the mountain men to respect the spirits of the land, to offer thanks for a successful hunt, and to accept hardship as part of the natural order. They showed them how to read the signs of the weather, the animals, and the changing seasons, and to live in harmony with the world rather than in opposition to it. The mountain men who survived the longest and thrived the most were those who listened, learned, and adapted. They became students of the land, blending the best of European and Native American knowledge into a unique culture of survival. For all their skill and preparation, the mountain men were never immune to the dangers of the deep cold. Winter in the mountains was a relentless adversary, and even the most experienced trapper could fall victim to its tricks. Hypothermia was the silent killer. It crept in slowly, numbing the fingers and toes, clouding the mind, and sapping the will to move. The mountain man learned to recognize the early signs: shivering, confusion, clumsiness, and to act quickly. He would build a fire, change into dry clothes, and eat something fatty to stoke his internal furnace. He knew that once the shivering stopped, the danger was greatest, and that sleep in the cold could be the last sleep of all. Frostbite was another constant threat. The mountain man checked his fingers, toes, nose, and ears for signs of numbness or discoloration. He learned to warm frozen flesh slowly, never rubbing or exposing it to direct heat to avoid further damage. He knew that a lost finger or toe could mean the end of his career, and that prevention was always better than cure. Snow blindness caused by the glare of the sun on the snow could leave a man helpless for days. The mountain man fashioned goggles from wood or bone with narrow slits to reduce the light. He learned to travel at dawn and dusk to rest during the brightest hours, and to keep his eyes shaded whenever possible. Avalanches were the terror of the high country. The mountain man listened for the telltale cracks and rumbles, avoided steep slopes after fresh snow, and traveled in the company of others when possible. He knew that a single misstep could trigger a wall of snow that would bury him alive. Thin ice was a hidden danger on rivers and lakes. The mountain man tested the ice with his staff, listened for the creaks and groans, and avoided crossing whenever possible. If he fell through, he knew to keep his head above water, to kick his feet and crawl onto the ice, and to strip off wet clothes as soon as he reached safety. The dangers of the deep cold were many, but the mountain man faced them with courage, caution, and respect. He knew that survival was never guaranteed and that every day in the mountains was a gift stolen from the jaws of death. While the summer rendezvous was a time of trade and celebration, the winter rendezvous was a quieter, more somber affair. In the depths of winter, Small groups of mountain men would gather in sheltered valleys or along frozen rivers to share news, pool resources, and support each other through the hardest months. The winter rendezvous was a time for storytelling, for mending gear, and for planning the next season's trapping. The men would sit around the fire, swapping tales of narrow escapes, great hunts, and the ever-present dangers of the cold. They would share food, tobacco, and whiskey, and offer advice to the younger or less experienced trappers. It was also a time for reflection. The mountain men would remember those who had not survived the winter. Friends lost to avalanches, frostbite, or starvation. They would mark their passing with a moment of silence, a shared drink, or a story told in their honor. The winter rendezvous was a reminder that for all their independence, the mountain men were part of a larger community. They relied on each other for survival, for companionship, and for the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle against the cold. The cold was the mountain man's greatest teacher, and every hardship, every danger, every narrow escape was a lesson carved deep into his bones. The wisdom gained from surviving winter was practical, immediate, and unforgiving. Winter taught truths that no book could teach. Each day brought new challenges, and each challenge demanded a solution that worked. Or else, he learned that preparation was everything. The man who planned ahead, who stocked his shelter with firewood, who kept his gear in good repair, and who never let his guard down, was the man who survived. He learned to read the land for signs of weather, to judge the thickness of ice, and to recognize the subtle warnings of frostbite or hypothermia before they became fatal. He learned that humility was a virtue. The mountains were bigger, older, and more powerful than any man. The cold was indifferent to suffering, and nature rewarded those who respected her laws. He learned to adapt his routines, to improvise with what he had, and to accept that sometimes the only way forward was to wait out the storm. Over time, he discovered adaptability was the key to survival. The man who could change his plans, improvise with what he had, and learn from his mistakes was the man who thrived. He learned to make do with less, to repair rather than replace, and to find new uses for old tools. Through hardship, he discovered community was strength. The man who shared his knowledge, his food, and his fire with others was the man who built a legacy that would outlast any single winter. He learned to listen to the wisdom of others, to teach what he knew and to accept help when it was offered. He learned that endurance was its own reward. The man who could keep moving, keep hoping, and keep fighting even when the odds were against him was the man who mastered the cold. The lessons of winter were hard, but they were honest, and they shaped the mountain man into a survivor whose knowledge was as sharp as his knife and as enduring as the mountains themselves. Yet for all the practical wisdom the cold imparted, the greatest struggle for the mountain man was often fought in silence deep within his own mind. The psychological battle of winter was as real and as dangerous as any blizzard or hungry wolf. Isolation, loneliness, and the slow erosion of hope could be as deadly as frostbite. Loneliness was a constant companion. For weeks or even months, a mountain man might see no other human being. The only voices were the crackle of the fire, the howl of wolves, and the whisper of snow against the canvas of his tent. Some men talked to themselves, to their horses, or to the spirits of the land. Others sang old songs, recited prayers, or carved notches in a stick to mark the passing days. The darkness was oppressive. In the depths of winter, the sun might rise for only a few hours each day, casting a pale, cold light over the endless white. The nights were long and filled with dreams, some comforting, some terrifying. The mountain man learned to welcome the dawn, to find hope in the first rays of sunlight, and to use the darkness as a time for rest and reflection. Boredom was a danger as real as hunger or cold. With little to do but tend the fire, mend gear, and wait for the weather to break, the mind could wander into dangerous territory. Some men went mad from the isolation, haunted by memories or fears that grew larger in the silence. The mountain man learned to keep his hands busy, to set small tasks for himself, and to find satisfaction in the simple routines of survival. Fear was always present, the fear of freezing, of starving, of being lost or injured far from help. The mountain man learned to respect his fears, to use them as motivation rather than letting them become paralyzing. He knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. Hope was the antidote to despair. The mountain man learned to find hope in small things. A successful hunt, a break in the weather, the promise of spring. He carried memories of home, of friends and family, as a shield against the darkness. He dreamed of the rendezvous, of laughter and music, and the company of others. Hope kept him moving, kept him fighting, kept him alive. The solitude within was a crucible, forging the mountain man's spirit as surely as the cold shaped his body. Those who emerged from winter's darkness carried a quiet strength, a resilience that could not be measured, and a deep appreciation for the light. In the harshest conditions, the mountain men discovered that survival was not just a solitary pursuit. It was a shared endeavor built on trust, ethics, and a sense of brotherhood. The cold demanded cooperation, and the bonds formed in winter were as strong as steel. The mountain man's code was simple but profound. Self-reliance was essential, but so was generosity. In the wilderness, a man's life could depend on the kindness of others. The mountain men shared food, fire, and shelter with those in need, knowing that the favor might one day be returned. They traded fairly, honored their debts, and helped strangers without expectation of reward. Trust was the currency of survival, in a world where a man's word was often the only guarantee. Honesty was everything. The mountain men valued truth in their dealings, kept their promises, and expected the same from others. A liar or a cheat was quickly found out and shunned by the community. Courage and respect were the glue that held the brotherhood together. The mountains demanded bravery, not the reckless courage of a fool, but the quiet, steady courage of a survivor. The mountain man faced danger with calm determination, accepted hardship without complaint, and met death with dignity. He respected the land, the animals, the weather, and the people he encountered. When mountain men met in the wilderness, they would exchange news, trade supplies, and share stories around the fire. They would teach each other new skills, warn of dangers, and offer help in times of need. The mountains kept a plain covenant: offer help when you can, ask when you must, and do not abandon a man to the cold. The brotherhood forged in frost was not always harmonious. There were rivalries, conflicts, and betrayals, but in the end, the shared struggle against the cold created a bond that transcended differences and endured through hardship. In the heart of winter, trust and brotherhood were not luxuries. They were necessities, and they made the difference between life and death. Around a shared fire, they found warmth that no fur or blanket could ever give. As winter loosened its grip and the snow began to melt, the mountain man felt a surge of relief and anticipation. The world came alive again. The rivers ran swift and cold. The trees budded with new leaves, and the animals emerged from the dens. The hardest season was over, and the promise of spring brought new opportunities and new challenges. The first task was always to check the trap lines. Months of snow and ice could damage traps, scatter bait, and change the patterns of animal movement. The mountain man moved quickly, repairing what he could, resetting traps, and harvesting the furs that had been caught during the winter. The pelts were cleaned, stretched, and dried, ready for trade at the next rendezvous. Travel became easier as the snow receded, but the rivers were swollen with meltwater, and the trails were muddy and treacherous. The mountain man used his snowshoes as paddles, his staff as a probe, and his wits to navigate the changing landscape. He watched for signs of avalanche, landslide, or flood, knowing that the mountains could be just as dangerous in spring as in winter. Food became more plentiful. The first shoots of wild onions and garlic poked through the melting snow. Fish returned to the streams, and birds filled the air with song. The mountain man hunted, fished, and foraged, replenishing his stores, and rebuilding his strength after the long, lean months. The spring thaw was also a time for reflection. The mountain man took stock of his gear, his supplies, and his own body. He mended what was broken, replaced what was lost, and prepared for the next season. He remembered the lessons of the winter, the friends who had not survived, and the moments of beauty and wonder that made the struggle worthwhile. The return of warmth and light was a gift, but it was also a reminder that the cycle would begin again. The mountain man knew that another winter was always waiting and that mastery of the cold was a journey, not a destination. The era of the mountain men was brief, but its impact was lasting. These men opened the way for exploration, trade, and settlement in the American West. They mapped the rivers, blazed the trails, and built the relationships that would shape the future of the continent. But their greatest legacy was not in the maps they drew or the furs they traded. It was in the knowledge they gained and the lessons they left behind. The mountain men proved that human beings could survive and even thrive in the harshest environments on Earth. They showed that mastery of the cold was not about conquering nature, but about understanding, respecting, and adapting to it. Their skills and stories have been passed down through generations, inspiring new waves of adventurers, explorers, and survivalists. The techniques they developed, layering clothing, building shelters, managing fire, and reading the land, are still taught today in wilderness schools and survival manuals. The mountain men are gone, but their spirit endures. Every time someone lights a fire in the snow, builds a shelter from branches, or faces the cold with courage and humility, they are honoring the legacy of those who came before. As the sun sets on our journey, imagine one last night in the mountains. The fire burns low, casting flickering shadows on the snow. The wind rattles the branches, and the stars shine cold and clear above. The mountain man sits by the fire wrapped in his buffalo robe, his face lined with the scars and stories of 100 winters. He thinks of the friends he has lost, the dangers he has faced, and the beauty he has witnessed. He remembers the lessons of the cold, the importance of preparation, the value of community, the necessity of humility, and the power of hope. He knows that the cold will come again, that the struggle will never truly end. But he is ready. He has mastered the cold, not by defeating it, but by learning to live with it, to respect it, and to find meaning in the struggle. As the fire dies and the darkness closes in, the mountain man smiles. He is not afraid. He is at home in the cold, a master of survival, a brother of the mountains. A winter camp was more than a place to sleep. It was a fortress against the cold, a workshop, a kitchen, and a sanctuary. The mountain man's camp was a living thing, shaped by the land, the weather, and the needs of the moment. Site selection was the first and most important decision. The mountain man looked for a spot sheltered from the wind, close to water, and with plenty of firewood nearby. He avoided low-lying areas where cold air pulled at night, and he steered clear of avalanche paths, deadfall, and places where predators might roam. The shelter itself was built with whatever materials were at hand. In the timbered valleys, a lianto or a wickiup, a conical hut of poles and brush, could be thrown up in an hour. In the open country, a snow cave or a dugout in a riverbank might be the only option. The mountain man knew how to thatch a roof with pine boughs, how to seal gaps with moss and mud, and how to build a door from woven willow branches. Inside the shelter, the fire was the heart of the camp. The mountain man built his hearth with stones or dug a pit in the earth, always careful to keep the flames away from the walls and roof. He arranged his bed of pine boughs and robes close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid sparks. He hung his wet clothes and moccasins near the fire to dry, turning them regularly to prevent scorching. The camp was organized for efficiency and safety. The rifle and powder horn were always within arm's reach, ready for a sudden threat. The knife and axe were kept sharp and close at hand. Food stores were hung from a tree or cached in the snow to keep them safe from animals. Traps and snares were set along nearby game trails, checked each morning and evening. Water was melted from snow or chipped from the edge of a frozen stream. The mountain man used a kettle or a bark container to heat water for drinking. cooking, and washing. He knew that even in the coldest weather, a man could sweat and dehydrate, and he made a habit of drinking regularly. The winter camp was a place of constant activity. The mountain man mended his gear, cleaned his rifle, and prepared food. He carved new snowshoes, patched his moccasins, and made repairs to his shelter. He kept a journal recording the weather, the movements of animals, and the events of each day. He told stories to himself or to his companions, keeping his mind sharp and his spirits up. At night, the camp became a fortress. The mountain man banked the fire, checked the door, and listened to the sounds of the wilderness. He slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise, ready to defend himself or his camp from danger. The winter camp was his home, his refuge, and his last line of defense against the cold. Morning in a winter camp was a test of willpower. The fire had burned low, the air was sharp with frost, and every muscle ached from the cold. The mountain man woke before dawn, his breath rising in clouds, his body stiff and reluctant to move. The first task was always to revive the fire. He scraped away the ashes, searching for a live coal, and fed it with dry tinder and kindling. He blew gently, coaxing the ember to life, and soon the flames leapt up, casting a golden glow on the walls of the shelter. The warmth was a reward for his effort, a promise that the day could begin. Next came the water. He filled his kettle with snow or ice, set it on the fire, and waited for it to melt and boil. He drank a cup of hot water or tea, feeling the heat spread through his body, waking his mind and loosening his joints. Breakfast was simple but hearty: a chunk of pemmican, a strip of dried meat, or a stew of whatever game he had caught. He ate quickly, savoring the calories, knowing that every bite was fuel for the day's work. He dressed in layers, checking each garment for dampness or damage. He pulled on his moccasins, laced him tight, and wrapped his legs with strips of cloth or fur. He donned his capote, his hat, and his mittens, making sure that no skin was exposed to the biting air. Before leaving camp, he checked his gear: rifle loaded and primed, powder horn full, knife sharp, axe secure. He slung his pack over his shoulder, adjusted his snowshoes, and stepped out into the dawn. The rituals of the morning were a discipline, a way of preparing for the challenges ahead. The mountain man knew that a careless mistake, a forgotten tool, a wet sock, a missed meal, could have consequences that lasted all day or all winter. Every day in the mountains was a dance with death. The cold was always waiting, always watching, always ready to claim the careless or the unlucky. The mountain man learned to move with caution, to think ahead, and to respect the dangers that surrounded him. A sudden storm could turn a familiar trail into a maze of white, erasing landmarks and hiding hazards. The mountain man watched the sky, read the wind, and listened to the warnings of the land. He knew when to push on and when to turn back, when to seek shelter and when to risk the open. A fall through thin ice could be fatal. The mountain man tested every crossing, used his staff to probe the way, and moved quickly but carefully. If he broke through, he knew to strip off his wet clothes, build a fire, and warm himself before hypothermia set in. A misstep on a snowy slope could trigger an avalanche. The mountain man avoided steep terrain after fresh snow, traveled early in the day when the snow was firm, and listened for the telltale cracks and rumbles that signaled danger. A careless moment with a knife or axe could mean a deep cut, a severed tendon, or a broken bone. The mountain man kept his tools sharp, his hands steady, and his mind focused. He treated every task as a matter of life and death, because in the mountains it often was. The dance with death was not a morbid obsession, but a way of life. The mountain man accepted the risks, prepared for the worst, and celebrated every day that he survived. He knew that mastery of the cold was not about avoiding danger, but about facing it with courage, skill, and respect. Hunting in the winter mountains was a test of every skill a mountain man possessed. The snow muffled sound and revealed every track, but it also made movements slow and exhausting. The cold sapped strength and dulled reflexes, and every shot had to count. The mountain man rose before dawn, moving quietly through the frozen forest. He read the tracks in the snow: deer, elk, moose, and the smaller prints of snowshoe hares and foxes. He knew which trails led to water, which to bedding grounds, and which were the desperate wanderings of animals searching for food. He moved with care, placing each foot deliberately to avoid breaking through the crust or snapping a twig. He used the wind to his advantage, keeping his scent from drifting ahead. He watched for the flicker of an ear, the flash of a tail, the subtle movement that betrayed a hidden animal. When he found his quarry, he took his time. The cold made his breath visible, so he exhaled slowly, waiting for the wind to carry the vapor away. He steadied his rifle, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the trees, and the animal fell. The work was just beginning. The mountain man moved quickly to dress the animal, removing the hide and gutting the carcass before the meat could freeze solid. He saved every scrap: meat, fat, organs, and bones. The hide was rolled and packed for later tanning. The fat rendered for tallow. The meat cut into strips for drying or immediate cooking. He carried his prize back to camp, sometimes making several trips if the animal was large. He cached what he could not carry, hiding it from wolves and other scavengers. He built up the fire, cooked a meal, and gave thanks for the bounty. The winter hunt was a matter of survival, not sport. The mountain man respected his prey, took only what he needed, and wasted nothing. He knew that every animal was a gift, and that the balance of life and death was as delicate as the frost on a winter morning. Illness and injury were constant threats in the winter wilderness. The mountain man could not rely on doctors or hospitals. His medicine was the knowledge passed down from Native Americans, fellow trappers, and his own hard-won experience. For frostbite, he warmed the affected area slowly using his own body heat or the gentle warmth of the fire. He never rubbed frozen flesh, knowing it could cause more damage. He wrapped the limb in dry cloth, elevated it, and watched for signs of infection. For hypothermia, he stripped off wet clothes, wrapped himself in dry blankets or robes, and drank hot broth or tea. He shared body heat with a companion if necessary, knowing that warmth could mean the difference between life and death. For cuts and wounds, he cleaned the injury with boiled water or snow, applied a pus of pine pitch or crushed herbs, and bound it with clean cloth. He watched for redness, swelling, or fever, signs that infection was taking hold. He knew that even a small wound could become deadly if left untreated. For coughs and colds, he brewed teas from wild plants: willow bark for pain, spruce needles for vitamin C, YROW for fever. He rested as much as possible, kept warm, and drank plenty of water. For broken bones, he splintered the limb with sticks and strips of hide, immobilized it, and hoped for the best. He knew that a serious fracture could end his season or his life if he could not travel or hunt. The mountain man's medicine was practical, immediate, and often painful. He learned to endure discomfort, to improvise with what he had, and to accept that some injuries could not be healed. He respected the power of the land, and he honored the wisdom of those who had survived before him. Music and song were rare comforts in the winter mountains, but they were powerful tools for survival. The mountain man sang to keep his spirits up, to pass the long hours of darkness, and to remind himself of home. He sang old ballads from the East, learned from his parents or from other trappers around the fire. He sang work songs as he chopped wood, set traps, or built his shelter. He hummed lullabies to himself as he drifted off to sleep, the melody mingling with the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. Sometimes he made his own music: a whistle carved from willow, a drum fashioned from a stretched hide, a rattle filled with pebbles. He played for himself, for his horse, or for the spirits of the land. The songs of survival were not always happy. Some were laments for lost friends, for the hardships endured, for the loneliness that pressed in like the cold. Others were prayers for strength, for luck, for the coming of spring. Music was a way to mark the passage of time, to celebrate small victories, and to mourn inevitable losses. It was a thread that connected the mountain man to his past, to his community, and to the wider world. In the silence of the winter night, a single voice could fill the darkness with hope, with memory, and with the promise of another day. The mountain man learned as much from the animals as he did from any human teacher. He watched the behavior of wolves, elk, and beaver, learning how they survived the cold, found food, and avoided danger. He noticed how deer bedded down in the shelter of thick trees, out of the wind and close to water. He saw how beaver built lodges with underwater entrances insulated with mud and sticks, and how they stored branches for food beneath the ice. He learned from the birds, watching for the arrival of chickades and nuthatches, which signaled the approach of winter. He listened to the warning calls of jays and crows, which alerted him to predators or strangers nearby. He respected the wisdom of the bear, which fattened itself in the fall and slept through the worst of the cold. He admired the endurance of the wolf, which traveled in packs, shared food, and cared for its young. The mountain man imitated the strategies of the animals, seeking shelter, conserving energy, storing food, and moving with caution. He knew that survival was not just a matter of strength or intelligence, but of adaptation and observation. He honored the animals he hunted, using every part of the carcass and giving thanks for the life taken. He believed that the spirit of the animal lived on in the hunter and that respect for the natural world was the foundation of true mastery. In the winter mountains, warmth was a currency more valuable than gold. The mountain man learned to budget his heat, to spend it wisely, and to invest in the small comforts that made survival possible. Every action was weighed against its cost in energy. Chopping wood, breaking trail, or hauling water burned precious calories. So the mountain man planned his day to minimize unnecessary effort. He stacked firewood close to his shelter, gathered water in large batches, and set his traps in a circuit that allowed him to check them efficiently. He learned to share warmth with others. When two or more mountain men camped together, they slept close, back to back or side by side, sharing body heat beneath a pile of robes and blankets. In the coldest weather, even rivals or strangers would set aside their differences for the sake of survival. Huddling together like wolves in a den, he used every trick to conserve heat. He blocked drafts with extra hides, stuffed moss into cracks, and built windbreaks from snow or brush. He heated stones in the fire and placed them at his feet or in his bed to keep warm through the night. He wore a scarf or bandana over his mouth and nose to warm the air before it reached his lungs. He rationed his firewood, burning the best logs at night, and saving the scraps for cooking or quick warmth during the day. He learned to judge the quality of wood by its weight, color, and sound, choosing the densest, driest pieces for the coldest hours. He understood the value of dry clothing. Wet socks or mittens could steal heat faster than the coldest wind. So he dried his gear by the fire, rotated his garments, and used spare pieces as insulation. He knew that a single dry shirt could mean the difference between comfort and misery. The economy of warmth was a constant calculation, a balancing act between effort and reward. The mountain man became a master of thrift, ingenuity, and patience, always seeking new ways to stretch his resources and outlast the cold. Despite the isolation of the mountains, winter was not always a season of solitude. The mountain men found ways to connect, to celebrate, and to support each other through the darkest months. When two or more trappers met on the trail, they would share a fire, a meal, and news from the outside world. They traded stories of the hunt, compared notes on the weather, and exchanged tips on survival. They might gamble with cards or dice, play a game of checkers carved from wood, or simply talk late into the night. The winter rendezvous, though smaller than the great summer gatherings, was a time for camaraderie and renewal. Men, who had not seen each other for months, would greet each other like brothers. Sharing tobacco, whiskey, and laughter, they would pool their resources, help each other repair gear, and make plans for the spring. The mountain men also formed bonds with Native American families and bands. They learned the languages, married into the tribes, and adopted the customs of their hosts. Winter was a time for storytelling, for teaching the young, and for honoring the old. The exchange of knowledge, goods, and friendship was a lifeline for both communities. Even in solitude, the mountain man maintained a social life of the mind. He remembered the faces and voices of loved ones left behind, recited letters and poems, and imagined the conversations he would have at the next rendezvous. He kept a journal recording his thoughts, dreams, and fears, creating a record of his journey through the cold. The social life of winter was a source of strength, comfort, and hope. It reminded the mountain man that he was part of a larger world, that his struggles were shared, and that spring would come again. For all their skill and experience, mountain men were not immune to the dangers of overconfidence. The cold was a patient adversary, waiting for the moment when a man let down his guard. A trapper who traveled too far from camp without enough food or firewood could find himself stranded, forced to choose between risking frostbite or starvation. A man who ignored the signs of an approaching storm might be caught in a whiteout, unable to find his way back to shelter. The temptation to take shortcuts, to push through fatigue, or to ignore the warnings of the land was always present. The mountain man learned to listen to his instincts, to respect his limits, and to err on the side of caution. He knew that pride could be fatal. The stories of men who had perished from arrogance or carelessness were told and retold around the fire, serving as cautionary tales for the next generation. The mountains demanded humility, and those who forgot this lesson paid the ultimate price. The dangers of overconfidence were not just physical. The mountain man learned to guard against despair, loneliness, and the slow erosion of hope. He knew that survival was as much a matter of the mind as of the body, and that a single moment of weakness could undo months of careful preparation. As winter waned and the days grew longer, the mountain man felt a shift in the world. The sun rose higher in the sky, the snow softened, and the rivers began to run free. The return of the light was a time of celebration, relief, and renewal. He marked the changing season with small rituals, a new notch on his staff, a feast of fresh meat, a song sung to the rising sun. He cleaned his camp, repaired his gear, and prepared for the journey ahead. The animals returned to the valleys. The birds filled the air with song, and the first green shoots poked through the melting snow. The mountain man hunted, fished, and foraged, replenishing his stores and rebuilding his strength. He looked forward to the rendezvous, to the company of friends, to the stories and laughter that would fill the long summer nights. He remembered the lessons of the winter, the dangers faced and the victories won. The return of the light was a promise, a reminder that the cold could be mastered, that survival was possible, and that life in the mountains was a gift worth fighting for. Among the mountain men, the oldest trappers were revered not just for their years, but for the hard-won wisdom etched into every scar and wrinkle. These men had survived more winters than most could count, and their stories were as valuable as any tool or weapon. The elders taught that the cold was not a single enemy, but 1,000 small threats working together. They spoke of the little deaths, the numb finger that turned black, the careless slip on ice, the forgotten ember that let the fire die before dawn. They reminded the young that survival was a mosaic of habits, each one as important as the next. They passed down tricks that could not be found in any book. How to find the driest wood under a snow-laden pine. How to judge the thickness of river ice by the sound of your footsteps. How to use a rabbit's fur as a mitten liner. Or how to make a whistle from a willow branch to call for help in a blizzard. The elders were also the keepers of stories. Tales of men who had outwitted wolves, survived avalanches, or found their way home by the stars. These stories were not just entertainment. They were lessons in resilience, creativity, and humility. Younger mountain men listened with respect, knowing that every word had been paid for in blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. The wisdom of the elders was a living tradition, passed from fire to fire, winter to winter, generation to generation. Time in the mountains was measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythms of the land and the sky. The mountain man's year was a cycle of preparation, endurance, and renewal, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. Winter was the crucible, the time of testing. Every day was a battle against the cold. Every night a victory if you woke to see the dawn. The mountain man marked the solstice with a quiet sense of triumph, knowing that the darkest days were behind him. Spring was a time of hope and hard work. The snow melted, the rivers swelled, and the animals returned to the valleys. The mountain man repaired his traps, restocked his supplies, and prepared for the long journeys ahead. Summer was the season of abundance. The rendezvous brought trappers, traders, and Native Americans together in a riot of color, noise, and commerce. Furs were traded for powder, lead, and cloth. News and stories were exchanged. Friendships renewed, and rivalries settled. Autumn was the time of preparation. The mountain man hunted, fished, and foraged, filling his larder for the winter to come. He repaired his shelter, gathered firewood, and checked his gear. He watched the animals for signs of an early winter, and he listened to the wind for the first hints of snow. The mountain man's calendar was written in the tracks of animals, the flow of rivers, and the changing light of the sky. It was a calendar of survival, shaped by the cold, and the courage to face it. Mastering the cold was not just about holding on, it was also about letting go. The mountain man learned to release what he could not control, to accept loss, and to move forward with grace. He let go of comfort, knowing that pain and hardship were part of the bargain. He let go of pride, asking for help when he needed it, and admitting his mistakes. He let go of possessions, carrying only what he could not live without and leaving the rest behind. He let go of the past, forgiving himself for failures and losses, and focusing on the present moment. He let go of fear, trusting in his skills, his friends, and the wisdom of the land. Letting go was not weakness, it was strength. It allowed the mountain man to adapt, to survive, and to find peace in the heart of the storm. The story of the mountain men is not just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the power of human ingenuity, resilience, and community. Their mastery of the cold was a triumph of mind over matter, of spirit over circumstance. Their legacy lives on in the skills they developed, the stories they told, and the land they loved. It lives on in every camper who builds a fire in the snow, every hiker who layers up against the wind, every adventurer who faces the unknown with courage and humility. The mountain men taught us that the cold is not our enemy, but our teacher, that survival is not about conquering nature, but about learning to live with it. That the greatest victories are often the quietest, the fire that burns through the night, the shelter that stands against the storm, the hope that endures until the dawn. Their story is our story, written in the snow and the stars, waiting to be remembered and retold. As the fire burns low and the shadows lengthen, the mountain man reflects on the journey. He remembers the first frost, the long nights, the hunger and the hope. He remembers the friends he has lost, the dangers he has faced, and the beauty he has found in the heart of the cold. He knows that the struggle will never truly end, that the cold will come again, and that mastery is a journey, not a destination, but he is ready. He has learned the lessons of the winter, and he carries them with him into the light. The last ember glows in the darkness, a promise that warmth and hope will return. The mountain man smiles, knowing that he has faced the cold and survived. He is at home in the mountains, a master of the winter, a brother of the snow. And so, as you slip into your warm bed tonight, remember the mountain men who came before us. Remember their courage, their wisdom, and their unbreakable spirit. The cold is not your enemy, it is your teacher, and with the right mindset, you too can master